America, this is your heritage.
Separation of church and state is a phrase that we've had in American history for 400 years. But in the last 50 years, the court has interpreted it in such a way that it now causes the First Amendment to violate itself, amazingly. We have two clauses to the First Amendment. One guarantees the free exercise of religion so that we can freely express our religious faith, and the second prohibits the establishment of a national church. Well, the court now says, you know, if you exercise your religious faith, if you pray at a graduation, if you pray at a football game, if you pray at a city council meeting, you're unconstitutionally establishing religion. So what we've got now is if you do part of the First Amendment, you're violating the other part of the First Amendment. That is a really wacky interpretation.
And when did that change?
Well, it changed in 1947 when the Supreme Court decided that instead of using the language of the First Amendment, they're going to use the phrase separation of church and state to interpret the First Amendment. So that became the language of the First Amendment in their opinion, which is not necessarily bad. I mean, we use phrases to interpret constitutional clauses. But what they did, the phrase that had been given specifically to say that the free exercise clause is not to be touched by government. In other words, there's separation of church and state, and that will keep the government from stopping your free exercise of religion. 1947, the court says, we think separation of church and state goes better with the Establishment Clause. In other words, what we're going to tell you is that because of separation of church and state, you can't have the free exercise of religion in a public arena. Now, you can at home, you can at church, you can do free exercise of religion all day long if it's private, but don't try to get public with this. If your free exercise of religion gets public, then you've violated the separation of church and state.
For just short of 2 centuries, the First Amendment had prohibited the federal government from halting public religious exercises. But now, somehow, the First Amendment means just the opposite, all because the court took an 8-word phrase from a private letter and twisted and completely reversed its meaning, and then made that phrase a replacement for the clear wording of the Constitution. That 1962 case redefined the First Amendment, and it's notable for other reasons as well, particularly for its use, or lack thereof, of precedents. Recall that when the 1892 Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Christian principles must remain the basis of American laws and institutions, it had offered nearly 80 precedents as a basis for that decision. The 1962 case was just the opposite, providing virtually no precedents to support its removal of voluntary school prayer. The justices on the court were simply ready to move America in a new direction. So in essence, they simply announced, we'll not have voluntary prayer in schools anymore. We now think that that violates the Constitution. Within 12 months of that original decision, in 2 additional cases, the court reaffirmed its removal of voluntary prayer and then broadened its prohibition to include Bible reading at school. This was an even more radical reversal than the removal of voluntary prayer.
How do they get by with chaplains that pray before sessions of Congress, before senatorial, you know, I mean, how does that
it's
work?
It's infuriating.
What happens is the very guys who wrote the Constitution, followed by the guys who wrote the First Amendment, are the guys who said, oh, we need to pay for religion. Religious expression is so important. Free exercise of religion is so important. We're going to put federal funds into making sure it occurs. So here they are saying, we're going to fund a House and a Senate chaplain. And by the way, those House and Senate chaplains were funded not to open every session of Congress with prayer. That was only half their duties. The descriptions of chaplains at that point had dual duties. One is they opened the House and the Senate with prayer on a daily basis, which they still do today. The second part of their original responsibilities were they were supposed to preach divine service, or Sunday sermons, every Sunday at the U.S. Capitol. So what we did was we hired chaplains to preach at the Capitol of the United States. We're preaching at the Capitol. What about separation of church and state? Exactly. Separation of church and state is to guarantee that you can have those public religious expressions. The U.S. Congress, same guys who wrote the Constitution and First Amendment, put money into paying chaplains not only to pray for them when they open, but also to preach sermons to them every Sunday in government buildings. Now, that's original intent. That's what was designed. That tells you what separation of church and state meant. And by the way, the American that's credited with giving us that phrase, separation of church and state, in the constitutional era is President Thomas Jefferson. So President Thomas Jefferson, responding to a letter that he had received from a group of Baptists saying, we're concerned that the government might stop our religious activities, he said, no, it's not going to happen. Separation of church and state, they're not going to stop your activities. He wrote that letter on Friday, January the 1st, 1802. That's where you find his separation of church and state phrase. Now, and by the way, that original letter is in the possession of the U.S. government. It's at the Library of Congress. And Jefferson, when he wrote that letter, there's a lengthy section where he took that little quill pen, all that ink, he wiped out a whole bunch of lines, just completely scribbled through them so you couldn't read what was there. So what's wiped out and what's replaced with that simple little phrase reasserts what he was saying. So Jefferson wrote that letter on Friday, January the 1st, 1802. On Sunday, January the 3rd, 1802, Thomas Jefferson went to the U.S. Capitol, to church at the U.S. Capitol, to hear his friend, the Reverend John Leland, preach the service at the U.S. Capitol. So what you got is on Friday, he writes separation of church and state, and on Sunday, he's in church at the U.S. Capitol? Doesn't he understand his letter? Yes, he understands it. His letter says the government's not going to stop religious activities. So this thing about paid chaplains, we've had that since the very beginning, and that was part of the proof that separation of church and state was to keep the government from stopping those activities.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Military chaplains have been the subject of a lot of attention recently. There have been a number of instances. I speak at a lot of military bases all over the world, and I have had for years chaplains coming up to me and saying, you know, we are now required to write our prayers out before we pray them. We have to turn them in advance, and we have to let the JAG attorneys go over them and edit our prayers before we pray them. Oh, no. Whoa, time out. That is certainly not the business of government, to get into what you're praying and what you're saying. But this has been going on for years. It's been an issue in Congress, a lot of legislation trying to solve this issue. We actually have had chaplains who have been disciplined and demoted for using the wrong words when they prayed their prayers. Now, we have all sorts of faiths in the military chaplain corps. And we got Muslims, we got Buddhists, we have Wiccans, we have Christians, we have Jews. It's not the business of government to tell any one of them how to pray. Right. I may disagree with some of their prayers. That's fine. It's not my business to tell you how to pray, and it's sure not the government's business. But this has become a real issue in the military, and it's been a real object, and we have a lot of guys in Congress who not only are military, but they're very committed to religious liberties, and they understand original intent. And these are the guys that have been out there fighting and whacking away and pushing back the bureaucrats, pushing back the ACLUs, pushing back the seculars, saying, look, you don't have a right to tell us what to say when we pray, and you don't even have a right to tell us if we can or can't pray. Right. And that's an issue. But see, under the new separation of church and state as opposed to the original, the new has given them all the club they need to go in and beat up people. As a matter of fact, we have cases that have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court over the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church and whether they can be pro-life. They're saying that's a violation of separation of church and state. It's not a violation of separation of church and state for a church to take a position that the Bible takes a position on. But people say, yeah, but when you talk about the Bible being pro-life, that's a political position. You violated separation of church and state. Well, even if that were true, there's a free speech clause of the Constitution. Right. So what's happened is the separation of church and state phrase has trumped the free speech phrase. So if you exercise free speech as a religious individual in a public setting, if I were at school and exercised my free speech and said something religious, let's say your free speech doesn't count because separation of church and state.